All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and author of Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Sign up for the podcast feed at scotthorton.org or scotthortonshow.com. I've got more than 6,000 interviews in the archive for you there going back to 2003. And follow me on all the video sites and X at Scott Horton Show. Hey, you guys, on the line once again, although for the first time in a long time, I've got Ken Klippenstein. He's an investigative reporter, and boy, does he investigate stuff, and he's got his hands on some important things. And his Substack is kenklippenstein.com, and he's got a couple of articles here, starting with the Iran War Plan. Welcome back to the show, Ken. How are you?
Hey, Scott. I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me.
Very happy to have you here. So you got your hands on some documents, huh? The DOD kind?
Yeah, the military planning kind, which is becoming relevant now if you look at the war of words between President Trump and Iranian leadership, and now the war of actual actions. If you look at the strikes against the Houthis in Yemen, I thought that made all of this relevant.
Okay, so, well, I mean, just take us through it. What do you got?
Yeah, so the strikes on Houthi forces in Yemen, I thought was kind of poorly reported by the press, which kind of took it as a chance to, just sort of titter at the Trump administration for doing the same thing that the Biden administration had done. It's true that the Biden administration had carried out a bunch of strikes on the Houthis, which were not effective. Obviously, the Houthis are still attacking, ships in the Red Sea, which is a corridor that a lot of commerce passes through. But there was one big difference between the two sets of strikes. And obviously, I'm not defending Biden's policy. I'm just saying that they were different, and the media sort of missed this. The difference was that the Houthi strikes conducted by Trump this month targeted command and control facilities as well as senior Houthi leadership, which, not only the Houthis made clear in their own statements to media, but National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said that as well. And that's a very significant escalation, which I think was just sort of overlooked by the press, because when they do something like that, that is going to provoke a response. And indeed, I think it was reported last night that the Houthis launched a missile at Israel, and they claim to have launched missiles at U.S. assets in the region. And what's concerning about that is Trump has said that he's going to treat now any attack by the Houthis as an attack by Iran. And in his mind, they're one and the same. He points to the Iranian support, logistic and otherwise, for the Houthis, but that's a big departure from how the Biden administration treated it.
Boy, we better hope that America's not 100% responsible for every proxy our government supports, like our current conflict with Russia right now.
Yeah, funny how that only works in one direction, huh?
Yeah. Well, so listen, I was very sympathetic, not to the Houthi regime, but to the poor Yemeni people stuck between Obama's essentially just making this corrupt deal with the Mohammeds bin Zayed and bin Salman in UAE and Saudi to launch this war against these people who've done nothing. In fact, even the horrible, evil Houthi rebels were working with Obama and were working with Lloyd Austin to hunt down and kill al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula at the time, which I'm not in favor of that, but at least they're the enemy who killed American civilians and all that. Although fighting them just made matters worse, of course. But anyway, but then, and I understand that I guess I believe them when they say that they're fighting on the side of the Palestinians, that they're obligated to intervene when there's a genocide going on, and there is one. And yet I kind of lectured my Yemeni friend when they started intervening last year, or I guess was it in late 23 or was it in 24 when they started intervening, that, yeah, I understand you got all your reasons and whatever, but this could turn into a regional war. Even under Joe Biden, it's not a stretch in the mind of the American foreign policy establishment that Shiite means Iran. And if you guys are doing this, then it's the Ayatollah doing this, and it could really spread. And it was already, of course, spreading to Lebanon and into Syria and whatever. But so just like you're talking about is a real danger, even though it's not true that the Houthis are Hezbollah and are that loyal and that close to Iran. It took the Iranians years to recognize the Houthis after they took power in the end of 2014. And they've not been that close. And Yemen's been under a blockade most of the time. So, what do? PayPal them some money or email them some schematics for how to make a drone or something. But otherwise, the rest of this is all embellished alliance anyway. Iran and Yemen don't really have the ability to help each other at this point in any meaningful way. So I think it's probably a real stretch. I don't know exactly what's going on with their relationship now, but I bet it's a real stretch to talk about their relationship as being that close, and certainly to blame Tehran for everything that Sana'a does just makes no sense. Or not without them really demonstrating why it should,
Right. It's particularly silly in the context of we have some very prominent examples now of powerful countries and their partners diverging, let's say, on their objectives, whether that's in Europe with Ukraine and disagreement over how to, wrap up this war, or as you said earlier, U.S. and Israel, even within the Trump administration, which is very pro Israel. They clearly, with their negotiator Steve Witkoff, are having a lot of disagreements about how to handle the Gaza war, even though, again, overwhelming support from the Trump administration in a lot of ways. These things are always more complicated than this sort of one-to-one binary picture that Washington tends to have about, okay, it's a client, therefore everything they do. I mean, the metaphor I use is to think of, on a much smaller scale, just a family and kids. I mean, clearly the parent has all of the power on paper. I mean, they're a legal guardian, so on and so forth. How often do you know that kids are doing exactly what their parents want them to do? Almost never, right? It's
well, and in fact, in this case, too, I'm sorry, just one more. The Iranians told the Houthis not to take the capital city at the end of 2014 because they said, you're going to cause a war. The Saudis are going to bomb you. Don't do it. And they ignored that. So how do you like that for an example?
Yeah, when the press covers this stuff, it's always Iranian backed. And it's like, I guess maybe for economy, you can say that, but what that leaves out and sort of misleads audiences about is then you think it's like just a private security force that answers to them, and the picture is much more complicated.
And they still call them rebels, even though they literally captured the capital city a decade ago.
Yeah, the whole discourse around it is really dumb. Another thing, you made an important point when you said, things are already quite tense. There's going to be, on the part of the liberal press now, I think, this attempt to, act like suddenly all this is happening. But the reality is those strikes that Iran carried out on Israel, then Israel carried out back in response to them, the assassination of, Hania, all this stuff is like very serious. And a frustration of mine, I pay very close attention to the military side, was when I was watching the press conferences by the Biden Pentagon. They would repeatedly say, "Oh, we're avoiding a large-scale war," and that, I guess, that might be true in the sense that there's not a huge ground invasion of the Iraq sort, but what that sort of glosses over is the highly targeted fighting that's happening, the airstrikes, the assassination campaigns, the shadow war, as it's been called. Which I think is just the face of warfare today. I mean, look at what happens when Russia goes into Ukraine. It doesn't go well. And so war doesn't really look like that anymore. And, a theme I've tried to hammer on in my newsletter that you mentioned at the top is that the war is already happening. And to say that, we need to avoid war, conceals from people the fact that there is already active hostilities. There are people being killed. There's fighting that is happening now. And yes, that could intensify, but it's already there. And so, it's not about preventing a war. It's about stopping the one that we already have.
Right. Okay, so tell me everything about these war plans that you have and what they describe.
Yeah, so I learned from a kind of cache of procurement records that provide some insight, frustratingly elliptical and contextual, into the Pentagon's kind of third generation. They're updating their war plans for Iran, which has only really happened twice before. So in the piece, I kind of sketch out, just broadly speaking, how the Pentagon's first war plans for Iran were established in the context of the Cold War, when when there was different leadership in Iran, political environment was pretty significantly different in a lot of ways. And then when 9/11 happened, then they were kind of like, I think there's just a sense in popular culture that it's like, oh well, the military plans for everything. But the reality is that to prepare for a major theater war, I think is the phrase that's used in these planning documents, is really expensive, time intensive, and and for the first time ever, it's an across the U.S. government effort. It's not just the Pentagon. They're coordinating with the CIA. They're coordinating with other parts of the U.S. intelligence community. So this is a huge undertaking that they're doing. First time since at least a decade, probably a couple decades. And what's interesting about how they're plotting this out is what is the catalyst then? Why don't they rely on the same broad operations plans, concept of operations that they had previously? Well, like I was saying before, the nature of warfare has changed, and the battlefield has changed as well. I think people really overlook the significance of that set of strikes that the Iranians carried out against Israel in 2024, because that was within the military. Just talking to people, that was a like sort of 9/11 event for people that focus on the CENTCOM region. Because if you think about it, what is an example of something like that happening before?
Right.
And so
the damage wasn't that great, but the spectacle sure was, exactly. Which is what the point of it was, right? And this is one thing that I don't know if the Trump government appreciates this very much, or I guess actually maybe they don't appreciate it the same way I do, but you talk about this in the article that the Ayatollah sort of does these weak, in effect, sort of symbolic strikes because we can't let this aggression go unpunished, but he also never seems to really be trying to escalate the thing. He doesn't want to fight. Obviously, Persia's in a position of weakness compared to the United States. What's he really going to do about us? You know what I mean? But I think you say in here, and I'm not sure exactly if this is just your interpretation or if people are telling you this too, that Trump seems to just take the lesson that, well, I can do what they want, and they're not really going to do anything.
Oh, exactly. And that's the lesson that CENTCOM has taken as well. I mean, look at the Houthi strike. The sense that I get from talking to people is that they looked at the not just Trump's strike on Soleimani, but the Israeli operation killing the senior Hezbollah leadership, including Hassan Nasrallah. And the discussion at the time was, oh my God, there's going to be this huge backlash, and you're really going to pay for it. And so since there wasn't that, CENTCOM looks at it and they think, wow, well, we totally got away with that. And so I think on the political side, on Trump's side, he thinks, well, there was basically no downside for me. And then on the military side, the Pentagon side, they think, okay, well, looking at that, it seems like it was a big success for Netanyahu. So what's the downside here? So I think the risk appetite has really dramatically changed beyond the one that already existed. Because again, we were carrying out, the Biden administration was carrying out constant airstrikes. It seemed to have little and no effect. For whatever reason, they think that intensifying that will have effect. Now, we've already seen within like the several days since the strike, the Houthis not just striking at U.S. assets in the area, but Israel as well. So it seems to me that this is just pouring gasoline on the whole thing. And in the context of all this, Trump has a new plan that he didn't have in 2020 when he left office, which is updated to incorporate all kinds of different things from military deception, small scale stuff, right up to the use of nuclear weapons. And there's no discussion of any of the change in defense doctrine, what triggered it, which is a lot of the geopolitical stuff I'm talking about now, the sense that you can get away with more, that Iran is weaker than we expected, that somewhat paradoxically that they carried out this strike and something has to be done. I think the press and to some extent ordinary people kind of understandably saw that strike and they thought, well, I don't think they killed anyone. It was just in Israeli military facilities, and they said, okay, so good thing nothing major happened. But within the halls of the Pentagon, they're not looking at it that way. They're looking at it as, I believe, the first ballistic missile strike on Israel from Iran in at least 30 years, maybe I don't know what. So that was really unprecedented, just in a sort of abstract doctrinal sense, which is how the top brass of the military tends to see a lot of things. They're not looking at it in the same common sense way that ordinary people would, which is to look and say, oh, thank God no one was hurt. Let's move on. That's not how they see it. So he comes Trump comes into office with this new updated plan. And I think another misconception that people have about war planning is they say, oh, the Pentagon plans for everything. Like I was saying before, not only is it very costly to do so, it's a huge bureaucratic undertaking that takes years to complete. And it wasn't undertaken by Trump. This was a Pentagon thing. But so that they undergo the updates for this whole plan. And what's interesting about it, so again, I think that the kind of counterpoint to this, the reason media probably hasn't picked up this story is to some extent they think, okay, so there's a plan. So what? That's not going to happen. Well, we have a parallel sort of experiment that history conducted for us, which was in 2020 when Trump was presented a menu of options. Today, that menu would include this war plan as to how to respond to. I think that killed an American civilian Pentagon contractor in Iraq, if I remember correctly, an Iranian-backed militia group, or however you want to call it. They briefed Trump on a menu of options, and ordinarily they'll give them three. And the bureaucrats' strategy here is to try to steer the president or the principal towards the middle option and make them feel like the one at the top is the extreme one, so they won't pick it. And at the top of that list was the decision to kill Soleimani, and Trump ended up taking that. And it's been reported at this point, I think pretty conclusively, that his aides were shocked. They were not expecting that. So I don't think that, first of all, with Trump individually, you can count on him just picking the moderate option or whatever. And secondly, the geopolitical situation is entirely different. And third, I don't think anybody can look at the Trump administration, whether you like what he's doing or not, and say that he has a lower risk appetite or even the same one than he did in his first administration. So all of that is what motivated me to write this story, and why I think people should approach this with some concern rather than just, oh, it's just a plan. What can they do?
Yeah.
It's more than that.
Okay, well, so it's important what you said there, that this isn't Trump's plan. This is, and there's a lot of people trying to speak for the incoming Trump administration. Like, remember, Robert O'Brien wrote that thing in Foreign Affairs about here's how it's going to be, everybody. So,
Yeah.
So it's important that, as you say, he didn't order this. There are also times when he tangled with the Ayatollah where he actually even let the Ayatollah have the last word. I can't remember if it was Soleimani. I think it was the Soleimani thing, where then the Ayatollah launched some missiles at the empty corner of an American base in Iraq. And some guys did get concussions from that, but still, they deliberately didn't kill anyone. And then Trump let him have the last word and didn't continue to escalate. There was also when the drone got shot down. And I don't know if he was skeptical of whether the Pentagon was lying to him or not. I am, about where exactly that drone was. But then apparently he asked, well, how many people are going to die? And they said, well, no civilians. He said, no, how many Iranian military will be killed if I do the strike that you want me to do? And they told him, and he said he didn't want to do it, which, makes him more of a hippie than Jimmy Carter, really. You know what I mean? I don't know. At least on that anecdote, and I know it all started, not that one, but he did do assassinations. I mean, he bombed Yemen for 4 years straight, and Afghanistan too, and whatever, so don't get me wrong. But at least in that case, he didn't just go along with them, or he certainly could have been worse. On the other hand, he and Mattis both agree that he wanted to assassinate Assad, and that Mattis stopped him from doing it. Where the worst thing about Mattis is what an Iran hawk he is, which that's what's wrong with Assad, is he's friends with Iran. And Mattis talked him out of it, apparently, or refused to do it. But anyway, so yeah, it leaves a lot to speculation. But tell us more about the global campaign plan and what this thing would look like. I guess here's one thing that maybe you could address too, which is, maybe you kind of already did, that all of this tit for tat on a relatively lower level, where the Ayatollah takes a few on the chin because what else is he going to do about it? There's a limit there. And this goes to, W. Bush back in January of 2007. The chiefs told him, we don't want to do this. Like the Air Force and Navy think it'll be fun, but the Army and the Marines and Special Operations Command, they do not want to go to Iran, especially not when they're in the middle of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. But also, even if they weren't, they don't. Because they got to do a lot of dying to try to even just take out the anti-aircraft, the SOCOM guys do, to even allow for the possibility of air superiority in this massive country full of mountains and all this stuff. And it's just, and the key word then was escalation dominance. We don't have it. We're not going to control every stage of the war, so we don't want to fight one. And even though we don't have 100,000 troops in Iraq and 50,000 in Afghanistan now, like we did then, we still have 50,000 or something in Kuwait. and we've got the Al Ulid Air Base in Qatar and the naval base for the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and CENTCOM Command in Qatar. And they have some anti-missile systems, I'm sure, but the Iranians could put up a hell of a fight over there if it came to a real go for broke, use them or lose them kind of a war with the United States there, and never mind all the economic targets in the GCC countries there as well. So it could very well escalate into a real war. And in fact, the Iraqi government would be loyal to Iran in that case as well. So any troops that we do have in Iraq would be subject to at least the threat of an Order 66 type stab in the back thing there. That's all to take into account here. That, yeah, they are in a position of weakness, but so was Ho Chi Minh. It didn't mean he wasn't willing to fight,
Yeah. Yeah. So just quoting from the procurement records here, they describe a, quote, unique joint staff planning effort. And the term that really jumps out is major regional conflict. So that's distinct from the sort of pinprick attacks that we've seen, the highly targeted, low intensity stuff that Washington is able to just sweep under the rug. This would be a more conventional kind of thing. I mean, this would involve multiple branches of the armed services, from cyber command to not just air power, but even sea power and troops as well. So I think the operative question here is what motivated them to update this? Because again, I think people have the sense that, they just do this periodically. But if you look at the two previous iterations, there's no regularity to it. They do this in response to perceived conditions that they think necessitate, needing to have some kind of plan in place. And it's particularly interesting given the orientation of the Trump administration, which and the military generally, which was supposed to be turning away from, the CENTCOM region, is supposed to be focused more in Asia. There seems to be, at least rhetorically, in the salons of Washington, sort of broad agreement that, yeah, we should be doing that. and then to update this whole plan, again, whole of government effort, you have to share intelligence. I mean, it's a bureaucratic headache. And then to do that, I mean, that certainly doesn't send the message of that we're going to gradually back away from CENTCOM. And I think that if you look at leadership's testimony to Congress, like General Kurilla, it's pretty clear that they see this shift away from, areas of responsibility, as they call it, away from the China area. They see that as a loss of their own portfolio, and so there's a bureaucratic imperative here to try to remain relevant. Right. And so I'm not saying anyone's going to start a war just to be relevant, but it leads them to estimate that military action is maybe a little bit more appealing than they might have otherwise. I think that's an important way to view this whole thing.
Yeah. Scott Horton coffee. It's a thing. It's really great stuff too. The Scott Horton Show Supreme Breakfast Blend from Moondo's Artisan Coffees at moondosartisancoffees.com. I drink a lot of coffee, and I drink a lot of Folgers and things over the years, but I'm never going back now. Moondo's is so good. And they have great wholesale deals for all you restaurateurs and Quickie Mart managers out there as well. They're now doing online commercial sales to coffee houses, coffee trailers, restaurants, and bakeries. So help support this show. Drink anti-war coffee. Click the link in the margin at scotthorton.org or just go to scotthorton.org/coffee. Seriously, buy some. And thanks.
Hey guys, I had some wasps in my house. So I shot them to death with my trusty Bug Assault 3.0 model with the improved salt reservoir and bar safety. I don't have a deal with them, but the show does earn a kickback every time you get a Bug Assault or anything else you buy from Amazon.com by way of the link in the right-hand margin on the front page at scotthorton.org. So keep that in mind. And don't worry about the mess. Your wife will clean it up. Well, folks, sad to say, they lied us into war. All of them. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq War I, Serbia, Afghanistan, Iraq War II, Libya, Syria, Yemen. All of them. But now you can get the ebook, All the War Lies, by me for free. Just sign up for the email list at the bottom of the page at scotthorton.org or go to scotthorton.org/subscribe. Get All the War Lies by me for free. And then you'll never have to believe them again.
Well, Okay, and so we have essentially, the situation going on with the Houthis. Now they can frame it however they want, but since the Houthis in reality are not just agents of Iran, I think we can take that as a pretext. So you mentioned in your article that they seem to have downgraded the pretended nuclear weapons threat, not entirely in their rhetoric, but in their actual thinking here. And Donald Trump, in fact, Trita Parsi pointed out that Trump even said, and this is absolute heresy from the chair he's sitting in to say this, there's, one school of thought says that Iran doesn't even really want a nuke even anyway, so we ought to be able to make a deal with them.
He's right.
You talk about in here, though, their escalation there, for example, working with Russia and their advances in missiles and drones. And so what else do you think other than, I don't know, what Netanyahu wants or what's the real motive for doing this, do you think?
Yeah, Trump is a difficult figure to report on because he doesn't adhere to the kind of MSNBC picture of him. Like, I don't, on the one hand, I think it's oversimplifying him to just say that he's an anti-war dove. But on the other hand, it's also oversimplifying things to just say that he's a warmonger. I mean, if you look at the case of the Soleimani strike, he was watching, it's been reported that he was watching the news, saw people criticizing him for not responding to the death of that, American civilian Pentagon employee. And he was just irate about the nature of the coverage and responded to it. So he responds to a different set of incentives than I think conventional politicians do, who might care more about what think tanks think. And that's why they wouldn't say what he said, which is, I don't think they really want one. And then the way the coverage is, I mean, the U.S. military has to issue I think it's called a nuclear posture review each year, where they summarize their best intelligence about, where the different nuclear threats stand at. And they always mention the Iranian regime. And every report, it's been consistent. I think the last one came out late last year, that yes, they are enriching, but the strategy is to get as close to possible to a weapon if you then make the decision to want a weapon, as opposed to actually wanting to go ahead and create it. They just want it to be something they can complete, approximate to some kind of urgent need. That doesn't mean they've decided to go ahead with it.
Right.
So it's the discussion of it is a lot more nuanced on the part of the military that actually has to watch these things than the news headlines are just like, the Iranians have, enriched another percentage or whatever. And there's just no context at all about that their strategy is not to obtain a bomb. It's to be able to get one if they have to. So I think, I think Trump is right in that case. And there's no evidence to suggest that they have crossed that line yet. And if the media told the truth about that, I think there'd be a lot more interest in Trump being able to proffer a deal that's perhaps more more realistic and able to win Iran's support than what he has. Because what it is now, it seems like a non-starter. Basically, the deal now is you have to preemptively give up your nuclear program as a precondition to being able to engage in any sort of serious agreement.
Right. And, I was talking with Mohammed Sahimi, who's a great expert in all of these politics, about how the new president, or relatively new president of Iran, how he had brought back Javad Zarif, the guy who had made the deal with John Kerry. And the idea was, let's at least be open to talking to the new Trump government. As soon as he comes in, let's see if we can play this nice. And I think at first they had said a couple of nice things, and then they turned to hardball. And then the Ayatollah said, well, listen, we're not going to deal with you if you're acting like that. And so the whole thing was set back unnecessarily. I think everybody who thinks along these lines at all, if they agree at all, ought to make this point all the time. Trump should just go to Tehran.
Yeah.
Right? If Nixon can go to China and shake hands with Mao Zedong, then Donald Trump can go and get along with the Ayatollah. And Netanyahu can pound sand or just cash another welfare check and shut up about it.
Yeah, I don't understand the aversion. I mean, again, Trump comes from this, I don't know how articulate he is about expressing it, but the general view is supposed to be focused on China. And so I would like to hear the ball put in Washington's court to have to explain why we need to still be litigating this 60-year-long, war When they themselves say that their focus is supposed to be elsewhere. I don't understand
Yeah.
how those two things fit together.
Well, and also, why do they want to switch their focus to China when we made friends with China 50 years ago? That's the whole thing. We don't have to have a fight with them either.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I'm just saying, even
Yeah,
from the
no, I
Hamas
hear you.
perspective, it doesn't make any it doesn't make any sense to me. Yeah. So
No, I
and
think
another
you're
thing,
right. No, it does make sense to you, and you already explained it, which is there's no such thing as the government. There's just a bunch of people who work for it, and they have their own interests in perpetuating this thing. Hillary Clinton tried to pivot to Asia in 2011, but events conspired to disallow that from happening. Some of them were directly at her behest, of course, like Libya and Syria, but you understand what I mean, though. They never quite get around to making that pivot. There's too much other stuff still going on.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a little bit alarming. I feel like the press has focused so much on things that I do think there should be coverage of, like Doge and the green card holders and things, that I can't find any investigation into. When Trump says, for example, maximum pressure, like what nobody seems to wonder what that means. If you think about it, that's kind of like when I think people say these sort of offhand things sometimes. They say, by any means necessary. And they don't necessarily know what that means. But if you think about it, it's like, okay, well, I don't think I'd want to do anything in pursuance of really any goal. Like, I'd have some things I wouldn't be willing to do. And in this case, I don't know that we want to do maximum pressure, like the most we can do. And so how does he define that maximal option? Is the maximal option like the one that he went ahead with in 2020 and killed Soleimani? If it is, there should be some kind of discussion of this instead of this unilaterally happening, in the White House. But I don't see any discourse about it to try to figure out like what are we willing to what consequences are we willing to accept as we climb up the escalatory ladder to try to pressure them to make a deal, which he's pretty open is his strategy. So I mean, it's strange because it's like he clearly doesn't have this issue with Ukraine. Well, why can't he approach it in roughly the same fashion where he's willing to talk to the other side and see where they're at? And
Because of the Likud. That's why.
Yeah, Israel.
Yeah. All right. So tell us about your follow-up here, the nuclear war plan for Iran. And that's, again, everybody at kenklippenstein.com.
Well, yeah, I found this particularly hair-raising just because if you look at some of the exercises they've been conducting, I think it was last month, they flew B-52 bombers. They didn't say where. The Pentagon is so careful to always say in the CENTCOM area of responsibility. And the effect that has, it might not sound like much, but that prevents headlines like I suppose I would have used in my newsletter, like saying, bombers conduct exercise right next to Iran, which is where it was. They dropped live explosives in an exercise in eastern Iraq along the border of Iran. And if you look at the Iranian press, they definitely know what's going on. They're not like CENTCOM where it's like, CENTCOM area of responsibility. They said, I can't remember which outlet it was, but I quote them as saying, these B-52 bombers are nuclear capable. They're at our borders. This is clearly pointed at us. And I think they're right. I mean, that is what that is. And so not just that, they've also flown joint exercises with the Israelis. Israeli F-16s, mid-air refuels, which is exactly what would need to happen if there was going to be a strike on Iran, maybe their nuclear facilities, because Israel's F-16s can't reach Iran and then make it back without a mid-air refuel. They don't have that. They don't have enough of that capability. So we have this escalation in these exercises that simulate exactly what you would need to do to hit them. And again, since the public doesn't know what's happening, because they're told, okay, well, nothing counts as war unless it's a full scale, unless there's boots on the ground. They can't mobilize against it because the media doesn't talk about it taking place. Because again, it doesn't cross that threshold. It's like they're still living in the 20th century where they think that every war is going to mean 40,000 troops or something. And it's like there's been a huge shift towards air. I mean, just look at even Ukraine, where Putin tried to do it that way with the ground troops. It's overwhelmingly drones and air power. And that's like, that's a much weaker military that's less sophisticated than ours. So I think we really have to update. I think particularly the anti-war movement needs to update its definition of what war is, because to me, this is war. This is what war looks like in the 21st century. Not just these exercises, but hitting Houthi leadership. I mean, in any political context, that's war. So and then Trump made it very clear in his statement. He says, We don't differentiate between the Houthis and Iran at that point. So think of the corollary of that. He's saying we struck Iran, right? since he sees them as one and the same. So with all that in the background, the nuclear planning, it was the part of the war planning that I thought was most concerning, just because, again, why update that? You already have the post 9/11 set of strategic plans for how to go about doing this. And again, there's a when I talk to people in the military, there is a sense that the political environment has shifted such that they're able to draft up different plans and I think see this more favorably. So, for example, they perceive that they have more support on the part of the Gulf states for things that they want to do, particularly the thaw with the UAE and the Abrams Accords. All of that, if you look at that, the way that's trickled down to military planners, CENTCOM, Israel used to be under EUCOM. Did you know that? It used to be under European Command because they didn't want to piss off the Arab Gulf allies by having them in the same AOR. So on Trump's last day in office in 2020, the Pentagon mandated that they were going to move Israel for the first time to the CENTCOM region, and that puts them fighting shoulder to shoulder with all the other CENTCOM partners. And I think, again, there was a sense that, okay, this is going to really piss people off. And it didn't happen to the extent that they thought. So they thought, oh, great, we got away with it. So we don't have to deal with the Palestinian problem. The Arabs are going to be fine. And all of this just leads to this sense of almost like when you're a teenager and you feel you're invincible. It's like you don't think anything's going to happen. And that leads to, I think, the extremes we're seeing in planning now. And just the general posture, and it's like there's no discussion of any of this because, again, everyone's waiting. Or the questions in the Pentagon press corps are always, are there going to be boots in the ground? And it's like if by the time it gets to that debate, it's too late. They've already decided to go ahead with the war, right? That's like a late stage development in war. So that's why I'm trying to look at this stuff at the planning phase as opposed to at the build-up phase where you have all these troops in Saudi or whatever, and it's too late because there's already so much bureaucratic momentum. It's not a video game. You don't just parachute in. It takes years of logistical preparation and planning, and that's exactly what we're seeing, and that's what this update in the war planning is.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things there is it probably would take nukes, but I don't even think nukes would really do it to take out Iran's nuclear facilities, especially at Qom and at Natanz. They're buried under 5 stories or more of granite down there. And it would take troops on the ground to go in there and destroy that stuff probably. Maybe, a few bunker busters in a row, but at that point, you don't really need nukes. I don't know, because, I don't know. I don't think nukes are maybe a nuclear bunker buster type special design thing, but I don't see, on the margin of like, are we really going to go that far? It doesn't seem like it's worth it when they have conventional ones. And then the good news about this, and I'm not saying it's a fail-safe because it sure ain't a fail-safe, but it is absolutely clear that Donald Trump is terrified of nuclear war.
Yeah.
And I don't think he has any interest in escalating to this kind of thing,
Well, I think another thing it's important to look at is the difference between when people think of nuclear war, they think of like the huge mushroom cloud and everyone's zombies. And they have a lot of low yield options now that they didn't before. They have a lot of what are called targeted strategic. So
usable nukes.
Right. So the idea on the part of the planners is, so this offers us steps on the escalatory ladder, as they call it, that are smaller than the leap up to like a thermonuclear bomb, for example. And so, I mean, in a sense, I guess that's good that they're not thinking thermonuclear, but it also risks thinking that any of those options are sane, because you can say, oh, it's just a small thing, like you said, targeted at their missile capabilities or whatever, and that opens up a whole, because then you've normalized it, and every nation looks at it like, okay, they did it, and so it would carry its own problems, but it's just complex. It makes the whole thing way more complicated.
Yeah,
I think. And
another thing they can do with nukes is they can bomb them conventionally, and they can tell them you better not fight back in any real effective way, or else we'll use nukes on you then, and just use them as that threat. You know?
I use a metaphor in the article. I say, people are waiting for the gun to go off in order to say stop, but there are intermediate steps between it, like loading the gun, cocking it, pointing it, like saying that you have nukes, saying what Trump has been saying, which is, what did he say? We can rain hell down on the Houthis. That's using a nuke. Like language like that is using the nuke in the same way that pointing a gun is using a gun.
You know what? Yeah, there's a great article, maybe even a book. I can't remember. I'm sorry. I forget the footnote, but I bet people could find this, where somebody did a history of America's nuclear blackmail and threats and the number of times, the unbelievable number of times that American presidents have threatened to use nuclear weapons, dating back to, Truman.
That's their main purpose. I mean, again, it's late in the game if you're waiting for a nuke getting like mounted to say, "Hey, don't do that." And that's my frustration with the anti-war movement generally. Is I think they're understandably operating on, opposition to a style of war that existed in the 70s or 80s, much less the 90s, and now it's like everything is much different even than it was. Just look at drones, for example. That's what, like 20 years ago that became, and everybody's still waiting for the ground invasion. They're like, no troops, no troops. It's like, that's not how it works. So I'm running around trying to explain to everyone, because we have this postmodern style of warfare now where it's so easy to ignore, right? Not just with AI, but with every aspect of it. It's air power. It's stuff that it's not people coming back missing limbs in the same way that it was even in Iraq. And so I don't think people's sort of immune system is updated to identify this pathogen, which is everything will be automated, everything will be farmed out to regional partners. Special operations will train them. You won't see any of it. Like in Ukraine, for example, we have all kinds of guys there. It's just that legally Biden or Trump can say we don't have anybody there because they're not under title. They're under the intelligence authority. They're advise and equip. They're telling guys how to point the guns, even in some cases helping them. But it's technically intelligence rather than boots on the ground. So the whole boots on the ground thing is just a layup for the national security state, because then they can say, hey, we don't have them. No worry, nothing to see here. And that's what they're saying with all the CENTCOM stuff is like, okay, yeah, we had 3 exercises of nuclear capable B-52s dropping bombs right next to Iran, but we don't have troops. So what are you worried about?
Right. Yeah, it's just the very edge of war. And hopefully we won't go, into a real ass bombing campaign in Persia. See, that's the thing, is that escalation dominance. I hope that the Pentagon is telling Trump the same thing that they told W. Bush, which is, well, we could win a war against them eventually and everything, but only at an incredibly high cost, and discouraging it in every way. Again, the story then was, Gareth Porter wrote about this, the Air Force was like, let's do it. We live in a Lockheed promo commercial, like promo video. We can do anything. It's fine. And then the SOCOM guys, and I guess the Army and the Marines too, but especially the SOCOM guys were like, yeah, no, we don't think we want to lose 10,000 guys, trying to put laser designators on anti-aircraft in this massive country. This is 3 times the size of Iraq, and with mountains and stuff, it's impossible to... the problem in history was the Persians taking over other countries. Nobody took them over, or I don't know who did. Maybe the Soviets for a little while.
Right. Yeah, I think it's particularly dangerous. Like, people tend to look at this as like the decider is Trump, but like you said, the state has many different components or factions or whatever. So CENTCOM has its own set of incentives, and we have all of these far-flung bases in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. And just going back to the Soleimani thing, all it takes is one of those getting hit, someone getting killed, and that changes Trump's entire calculus. Like, that's the incentive structure he's under, which is to not look like a pushover when an American is killed. And, I have to say, we saw 3, U.S. Army National Guardsmen killed in Jordan last year. Something like that could happen at any moment. And so the reason people need to think about this stuff now is, like, by the time that happens, you better have your arguments ready, or at least laid the groundwork for it, because it's too late. And then that's when he's going to be watching TV, seeing if people are making fun of him or not, and then decide whatever he decides. And it's the worst situation, because these far-flung bases have poor security. They're I mean, the Tower 22 case in Jordan that I mentioned a moment ago, that's a perfect example. It's these far-flung things that Americans don't think about, and as a result of that, they're not particularly well defended, and so they're just sitting ducks for any group, like we were talking about before, that might deviate from what Iran wants to do. I mean, you can't really stop them. So either we remove the troops, or you just forever have this button sitting there that all it takes is one guy willing to go against what Tehran wants to push that button. And then, we just pray that Trump doesn't get too angry at the coverage about it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And who knows how he might react to whatever some lady says on TV about him. God's sakes. This is the way the world ends, maybe. All right, listen, I better let you go. Thank you for coming on, man. Great to talk to you again, and great work here. Yep.
Bye.
All right, you guys, that's Ken Klippenstein, and he is at kenklippenstein.com. That's his great Substack over there. The Iran war plan and also the nuclear war plan for Iran he's got for you. Thanks for listening to The Scott Horton Show, which can be heard on APS Radio News at scotthorton.org, scotthortonshow.com, and the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org.